Hello, and welcome to the California Department of Education's Literacy Knowledge Building video series. This is part 2 in our series on culturally sustaining pedagogy. For this video, be sure to download the handout located on California Educators Together. This series is a series of videos on critical topics in literacy birth through grade 12. It was developed by the California Department of Education and literacy experts from the state literacy team, and it is complementary to the work of the Federal Comprehensive Literacy State Development Grants. You can learn more about this grant here at https://www.cde.ca.gov/pd/ps/clsd.asp. This video series is intended to provide guidance and resources on critical topics in literacy, to support the work of the CLSD grants, and to build coherence between California's literacy guidance documents, standards, and frameworks, and how they all support literacy. A primary objective of the CLSD grant is to bring coherence between California's guiding documents, some of which you see here, like the California Preschool Learning Foundations, the California Infant Toddler Learning and Development Foundations, the California Practitioner's Guide for Educating English Learners with Disabilities, the California English Learner Roadmap Policy, and the California Dyslexia Guidelines. Other content area standards and frameworks support literacy as well. The videos produced in this series will illustrate the connections between all of these documents and also explain how the documents themselves support literacy development for our students. Videos will be produced over the course of the CLSD grant period. To be informed when new videos are posted, join the CLSD listserv by sending a blank email to join-literacy-state-development-program@mlist.cde.ca.gov. And now I will hand it over to our presenters.
Welcome to the Culturally Sustaining Pedagogy Knowledge Building video, part 2. This is a 2-part video series within the State Literacy Plan Knowledge Building video series. In part 1, we will introduce what is culturally sustaining pedagogy. We will explore the valuing of community, languages, practices, and ways of being, and emphasize how schools are accountable to the community. In part 2, we will examine curriculum that connects to cultural and linguistic histories, sustaining cultural and linguistic practices, while providing access to the dominant culture. There are embedded scholar talks within these videos in which experts share their insights on how to implement culturally sustaining pedagogy. We encourage you to access the discussion questions to deepen your learning and collaborate with colleagues to discuss implications for implementation in your classroom, schools, and districts. Curriculum that connects to cultural and linguistic histories. One of them is the English Learner Roadmap. This is a very important principle that we need to shift, and it's a paradigm shift that we focus on assets-oriented and needs-responsive classroom practices, climate, curriculum, and instruction that responds to the diversity among English language learners. It's important that our students' cultures and languages are valued and affirmed and have a presence in the classroom and are built upon as assets for their learning. Assets are very important. All our students bring cultural and linguistic assets to our learning teaching context.
The 6 interacting instructional practices for multilingual and English learner students are to engage students in discipline-specific practices, to build their content knowledge, anchor the learning in real-world experiences and phenomena that are relevant and meaningful to students, value, promote, and cultivate students' cultural and linguistic assets to further the classroom community's learning. We also foster team-based learning and discussions grounded in collaborative sense-making, explicitly teach discipline-specific language and literacy with the goal of supporting reading, writing, and discussion in the discipline, use and help students to use multiple modalities to promote and enhance autonomy. Examples are provided in Improving Education for Multilingual and English Learner Students, Figure 6.2 on pages 354 to 355. This document also provides snapshots which encourage inquiry into students' families' immigration stories through interviews with family members and addressing topics that are relevant to students' cultures and communities and implementing standards-based disciplinary language and literacy goals. Dr. Goldie Mohammed, author of the 2020 book, Cultivating Genius, an Equity Framework for Culturally and Historically Responsive Literacy, will provide us with additional insight and examples. She is an associate professor of language and literacy at Georgia State University, where she serves as the director of the Urban Literacy Collaborative and Clinic.
Hi, everyone. My name is Dr. Goldie Mohammed. And when I think of culturally and historically responsive and sustaining education, I think of Black history, Black excellence, our ancestors giving us the roadmap of what types of standards that we should have for education, the purpose of schooling, and what schooling should be all about. When I think of culturally and historically responsive and sustaining education, I think of excellence and histories and teaching and learning and leadership that responds to students' histories, their identities, their literacy and language practices, how they read, write, speak, think, make sense of the world around them. When our education is responsive and helps to sustain who they don't have to feel like they are giving up any part of themselves in schools, in curriculum and instruction. They don't feel like they are checking their identities at the door. And not only are their cultures and race and histories and other identities sustained, but they are cultivated and nurtured so that they can fully become everything and everyone they're supposed to be, so that they can fully live up to their greatest potential. That is what culturally and historically responsive education is all about. That they become their brilliant and genius selves. And we need this work more than ever because we consistently have oppression in the world and pain and curriculum where our students cannot see themselves, breathe in the curriculum, learn, engage fully with the curriculum. We have curriculum and instruction and leadership that is so disconnected to their lives, to the world, and we need it more than ever. Our students are calling for it. They have been demanding it for such a long time. It's time for our schools to change, and not just change, but transform. Not just put what I call fresh coats of paint on the same curriculum, the same standards, the same teacher evaluation, the same programs that have not served all kids well. It's time for transformation. And culturally and historically and sustaining education has the potential to be that theory and that model for this transformation. And when I think of what it looks like, I think of the model that our ancestors gave us. They told us that we need to do 5 things in the classroom, that we need to do 5 things with curriculum and instruction and leadership. They said that we need to cultivate and advance students' identity development so that they can understand and learn and validate and love who they are and who they're not and who they want to be. They need to learn about people who are different than them, because when you learn about people who are different than you, you can learn the truth and dispel falsehood. And maybe you can love them and not hate. They said the second pursuit that we need in our schools and classroom is skill development, and skills that is connected to the world where they can apply those skills to real life, not skills taught by worksheets and textbooks alone. They said we need intellectualism. We need to cultivate a sense of learning about new people, places, things, ideas, concepts. Our ancestors, when we study Black historical excellence, have never been for just the cultivation of skills. They never could just be about the cultivation of skills. It was always about all these other things connected to their lives and connected to the world. And the fourth pursuit they had, and will help us to teach in culturally, historically, and sustaining ways, is criticality. We need to teach students about justice and liberation and truth, about racism, anti-Black racism to start, and other oppressions in the world toward this idea of a better humanity for all. Right now in our schools, we have a better humanity for some. We have curriculum for some. We don't have standards and curriculum and instructional practices that are grounded in Black liberation. So we're not serving all students. And then the fifth pursuit toward these ideals of justice and equity and anti-racism and culturally responsive learning is joy. How are we elevating images and representations and narratives of beauty in our schools and classrooms? How are we telling the truth about people of color? Are we centering the narrative in pain and oppression always when it comes to people of color? Or are we centering the narrative in joy and genius? And so this work is needed today, right now. And we have to be urgent about our leadership and about our pedagogies if we really want to see different results. Because our teachers need and deserve these things, and our students and their families need and deserve these things too. I cannot think of one child who does not need identity, skill development, intellectualism, criticality, and joy.
To reiterate, the tenets of Muhammad's equity framework for culturally and historically responsive literacy are identity, knowledge and affirmation of self and others, skills, content area skills and proficiencies, intellect, knowledge put into action, criticality, understanding of oppression, equity, and anti-racism, and joy, elevating beautiful and truthful narratives.
Anti-racism pedagogy centers on being conscious that racism is pervasive and one just can't be not racist, but must work to be anti-racist. It acknowledges white supremacy and seeks to actively disrupt racism. Counter-narratives and identity work are central to being anti-racist. To implement anti-racist pedagogy, it is important to self-educate and acknowledge racial trauma, interrogate your positionality and unconscious biases, address curricular gaps with intentional course design, and foster a compassionate class community and meet students where they are and engage the wider campus community and commit to action beyond the classroom. Does your curriculum provide students access to multiple perspectives and counter narratives to the dominant hegemonic narrative? Do the texts you select include the narratives of Black, Indigenous, and people of color? Are you looking at the content and asking whose story is missing? Can you start the story in a different place, time, or from a different perspective? Chimamanda Adichie states that a danger of a single story leads to misunderstandings. In the movement called Disrupt Text, many teachers, including Trisha Ebavia, have agreed upon the following pillars. Pillar 1, continuously integrate our own biases to understand how they inform our teaching. Pillar 2, center Black, Indigenous, and people of color in literature. Pillar 3, apply a critical literacy lens to our teaching practices. Pillar number 4, work in community with others, especially Black, Indigenous, and people of color. Learn more at www.bit.ly/disrupt text pillars. The next feature of culturally sustaining pedagogy is sustaining cultural and linguistic practices while providing access to the dominant culture. In shifting from a deficit approach to assets-based approaches, the goal is to provide access to dominant practices while sustaining home and community practices. The view of home and community culture includes resources to honor, explore, and extend. For example, culturally relevant pedagogy is a theoretical model that focuses on multiple aspects of student achievement and supports students to uphold their cultural identities. Culturally relevant pedagogy also calls for students to develop critical perspectives that challenge societal inequalities. Gloria Ladson Billings proposed 3 major components of culturally relevant pedagogy. A focus on student learning and academic success. B, developing students' cultural competence to assist students in developing positive ethnic and social identities. And C, supporting students' critical consciousness of their ability to recognize and critique societal inequalities. All 3 components need to be utilized. Student learning is about the students' intellectual growth and moral development, but also their ability to problem solve and reason. Cultural competence includes skills that support students to affirm and appreciate their culture of origin while developing fluency at least in one other culture. Critical consciousness includes the ability to identify, analyze, and solve real-world problems, especially those that result in societal inequalities. Critical consciousness requires educators to persistently question why things are the way they are and to examine how oppression, racism, and other systems that perpetuate inequities have influenced the way they see themselves, their world, their students' families, and their students' communities. The development of deep awareness and critique of the historical roots and contemporary social dynamics that sustain the marginalization. Cultural proficiency is about holding the vision that you and the school are instruments for creating a socially just democracy, interacting with your colleagues, students, families, and community as an advocate for lifelong learning to serve effectively the educational needs of all cultural groups. For more information, visit https://www.esc4.net/assets/cultural-proficiency-continuum.pdf. The simile of culture as an iceberg refers to surface culture, external and often material are the top 10%, things like visible cultural expressions, food, clothing, dance, art, music. Importantly, however, deep culture is the bottom 90%, often abstract, language, communication, relationships and roles, attitudes and norms, beliefs, and cultures and values. But deep culture is the knowledge and unconscious assumptions governing one's worldview. It governs how we learn new information and is emotionally charged. Mental models help the brain interpret threats, interpret rewards in the environment. A challenge to values could produce culture shock or trigger the fight or flight response. The worldview we will carry into formative years is at this level, learning about students' cultures and providing opportunities for them to learn more about their own and others provides the mirrors, windows, and doors to understanding and global citizenship. However, according to Shiroki Hawley, conflating culture and race is a common misinterpretation among some individuals who work with diverse groups of students. For more information, visit the CDE's Assets-Based Pedagogy web pages. Assets-based pedagogy can be found at https://www.cde.ga.gov/asset-based-pedagogies.asp. From there, access more information on culturally sustaining pedagogy, culturally and linguistically responsive teaching, and culturally relevant pedagogy.
Culturally sustaining pedagogy is not just limited to the classroom. The California Department of Education's Model School Library Standards is an important framework that emphasizes the identification of the skills and essential knowledge that students need to be information literate. School library service, because of their very nature, have to be centered around access, equity, and opportunity because of the multiple literacies and modalities that create our modern landscape. This slide exhibits two of the model library standards, and it gives you an example of the intrinsic nature of multiculturalism that's embedded in this literacy education. In grade 5, students are asked to recognize the role of media to persuade, interpret events, and to transmit culture. In grades 7 and 8, students are asked to compare and contrast how literature, theater, and visual arts from different cultures or time periods convey the same or similar content or plot. Dr. Shiraki Holly states that as educators, it's imperative that we validate and affirm traditionally marginalized cultures and languages. These model library standards seek to legitimize and create positivity around historical institutional knowledge, research, social media, and mainstream media in which students have been told that their cultural and linguistic behaviors are bad, incorrect, insubordinate, disrespectful, and disruptive. According to the International Literacy Association, rich possibilities for pedagogy can emerge from literature collections in which all cultures are encompassed. None are excluded, and the sight of cross connections and nuance become the critical points to drive home. For students to recognize their own communities in the books they are taught or self-select is critical to the personal engagement that drives deeper literacy. Dr. Rudine Bishop's seminal essay, Windows, Mirrors, and Sliding Glass Doors, explains that when children cannot find themselves reflected in the books they read, or when the images they see are distorted, negative, or laughable, they learn a powerful lesson about how they are devalued in the society of which they are a part. She creates the metaphor of books as windows where students can see into other worlds, viewing different perspectives. And she also notes that books are sliding glass doors where the reader can step through and become part of a different world that the author has created. She also talks about that perfect light when books become mirrors. And mirrors can transform human experience and reflect it back to us. In that reflection, we can see our own lives and experiences as part of the larger human experience. And reading then becomes a means of self-affirmation. It is important to note that as we begin to select mirror and window texts for our students, that we recognize that there's also a spectrum of cultural authenticity amongst diverse books. Dr. Shiraki Holly developed a filtering system that helps educators recognize whether text is culturally neutral, culturally generic, or culturally authentic. Culturally neutral texts feature characters of color, but the stories are drenched with a traditional or mainstream theme, plot, and/or characterization. Culturally neutral texts are the least preferred text because they are essentially race-based. The only aspect of these texts is the color of the character's skin. Note, I do want you to understand that there are always exceptions. There are many high-quality texts that build literacy skills that are still considered culturally neutral. What we need to avoid is using a culturally neutral text when we're thinking that it's a culturally authentic text. Culturally generic texts feature characters of various racial identities, but they contain few and/or superficial details to define the characters or the storylines. So culturally generic texts tend to focus on mainstream cultural values, but with the use of non-mainstream characters. The last end of our spectrum are culturally authentic texts, and they're the preferred type of text for the culturally responsive educator. A culturally authentic text is a piece of fiction or nonfiction that illuminates the authentic cultural experiences of a particular group, whether it addresses religion, socioeconomic status, gender, ethnicity, nationality, sexual orientation, or geographic location. These texts are representative of the 3 filters for culturally responsive texts. Books such as Randy Rhoads' Ninja Detective, written by Octavia Spencer, and The Summer of Sticks Malone by Kekla Malone feature characters of color. But if you were to substitute those characters from any other racial or ethnic group, they could be easily substituted and it would not change the story. Diversity as a concept is very multifaceted and complex, ever-changing, and many culturally generic texts qualify what we would call today as multicultural or diverse. And a current example of culturally generic text is Everything, Everything by Nicola Yoon. And then a classic example is Corduroy by Don Freeman. These are books that have a theme that is not identifiable as an aspect of any particular culture. The Hate U Give by Angie Thomas, Ghost by Jason Reynolds, and Dreamers by Yuyu Morales are examples of culturally authentic texts. The language, situations, and the illustrations depict a culture in an authentic manner. One method of diversifying our literary canon is also by reframing classic novels that are read in secondary classrooms. Recognizing and addressing literary tropes that perpetuate a single perspective with counter-narratives allows our diverse student population to find mirrored access points and moments of connection. For instance, when students read To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee, they can consider the perspectives of oppressed characters like Tom or Calpurnia Zebo. We can help them build empathy and question what happens to the voices that are unexpected and unexplored in the novel. Students can tie this in with the Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's TED Talk, The Danger of a Single Story, and it can lead to discussions about how power affects narratives and storytelling. Another classic novel that can be reframed is The House on Mango Street by Sandra Cisneros, discussing housing segregation and the legacy of redlining in communities across the country. Many of our students may understand that racism exists, but they don't fully grasp the large societal structures in place that have historically disadvantaged people of color. The House on Mango Street can open students up to the concept of housing segregation and how it has affected generations of people of color. The Joy Luck Club by Amy Tan is yet another example of text that can be re-examined. This novel allows us an opportunity to teach students about the model minority myth. The model minority myth is the common belief that Asian American and Pacific Islander, AAPI immigrants, and their descendants are better off than other communities of color because of the presumed virtues of the AAPI community. This myth is harmful to self-perceptions of AAPI people and to attempts to advocate for academic or financial support for this community. For additional insight, we will hear from another scholar. Dr. Christine E. Sleeter is a professor and education activist. She is Professor Emerita in the College of Education at the California State University of Monterey Bay. She has helped hundreds of teachers become better teachers of the school's culturally diverse students. She has also served as the Vice President of Division K, Teaching and Teacher Education of the American Educational Research Association, and as President of the National Association for Multicultural Education.
Culturally sustaining pedagogy builds on the cultural, cognitive, and linguistic assets students bring to the classroom. And all students do bring such assets as a foundation for their academic learning and identity development. Culturally sustaining pedagogy aims not only to enable students to succeed academically, but it also prepares them to engage with and contribute to the cultural communities of which they are members. An interesting program I think of when I think of culturally sustaining pedagogy is called Math in a Cultural Context. This program originated in concerns of the Yupik indigenous community outside Fairbanks, Alaska, that Yupik kids were not doing well in math. But an anthropologist who is working with the community noticed that Yupik adults do use mathematical thinking in many everyday pursuits, such as designing clothing, cooking, and fishing. The problem was that how math is conceptualized and packaged in the classroom looks nothing like how math is used in the community. So, teams of math teachers and community elders were convened to design modules that would connect school and community math. The result is a set of 10 learning modules to use in the math classroom. They have titles such as picking berries, building a fish rack, and drying salmon. And they link grade-level math concepts with Yupik community knowledge. Using these modules, the children learn math and community knowledge in a way that is integrated and meaningful. I've been in classrooms of several teachers who exemplify culturally sustaining pedagogy. I'll describe one of them. She's a middle school teacher who works in a low-income, largely Mexican-American community. She isn't Mexican-American herself, but she speaks Spanish fluently and has spent considerable time in different parts of Mexico studying indigenous dances. She also lives in the community where she teaches and has become an active member of that community. I've spent time in her classroom while she was teaching dance, as well as Spanish for Spanish speakers. She organized Spanish for Spanish speakers as university preparation rather than as a remedial course, which is how it's often framed. She intentionally prepares students to pass the Spanish AP exam. When I was in her classroom, she was teaching students to analyze characters in a novel using La Ciudad de las Bestias by Isabel Allende. She explained to me that most of what her students had been given to read was boring to them because they couldn't relate to it. But she chooses books they can relate to, so she's probably the first teacher to get them to read whole novels. Her style of working with the students I would describe as personable, encouraging, and demanding. She expects them to learn to do more difficult academic work than they're used to. She scaffolds the work, models it, and lets them know that they can do it. To me, her teaching illustrates culturally sustaining pedagogy. She sees her students as the future of the Mexican-American community, indeed, as the future of this country, a future they can claim as Mexican-Americans. She treats their first language, which for many of them is Spanish, as an asset for learning and a part of the cultural wealth they possess. She knows her students, she knows their community's aspirations for them, and she knows what the kids themselves find interesting and motivating to use in her classroom. When I've worked in teacher education, I've built in community engagement as part of my multicultural education courses. To me, a teacher can't learn to teach in a way that's culturally relevant to his or her students, much less culturally sustaining, without spending time in their communities, getting to know the community in meaningful ways. My approach to this was to work with grassroots community-based organizations that could use my students as volunteers. I would collaborate with the community organization directors to figure out what they needed that my students could help out with and how learning could be structured while they were there. My intent was to give teacher candidates experience and tools for learning how to learn respectfully in someone else's community and to think through what implications they were learning would have for classroom teaching. One such learning tool was a set of interview questions to ask adults who live in the community about the community's strengths and assets. For many teacher candidates, doing this interview with several people created a paradigm shift in which they viewed a low-income community of color as rich with knowledge and caring people, rather than danger zones they should stay away from. Culturally relevant and sustaining pedagogy doesn't look exactly the same everywhere. Indeed, it builds on what is local. There isn't a checklist or a recipe for what to do. But I often tell teachers, your students should be thriving intellectually, culturally, and personally in your classroom. If you're using culturally relevant and sustaining pedagogy, they will thrive.
Thank you for viewing part 2 of Culturally Sustaining Pedagogy. access the discussion questions to deepen your learning with your colleagues. If you haven't already, make sure to watch part 1 of this series and check out the rest of the series as a whole. Thank you.